Hey gang, Voltie here, back with another deck tech. Today is going to be a continuation of the Hyper Budget series. So for those who don't know, basically these are going to be 7-point Highlander decks that cost under 75 USD. According to the cheapest printings, this comes in at just under $1 a card, and that way we can make sure that people are able to access the format that we know and love and get right into it. Today's deck is Boros Heroic, and we'll go through it. Basically, it's an incredibly aggressive deck that relies on the Heroic triggers as well as the Valiant triggers from some recent printings to make sure that you're getting as much value as possible out of your aggressive pump spells. And over time, you'll eventually be able to amass a board state where you have some protection spells and you can do a bunch of damage at once. So to start things off, we have Luris as our companion. This is the best bang for your buck, in my opinion, on the points list. For under $1, you get 3 points worth out of your 7 or 8, and you get one of the best companions, if not the best companion of all time, in Luris. Obviously, this does come with a restriction, and we do have to make sure our creatures and our permanents are cheap. However, it's quite easy to do when you're playing a lot of 1-drops. Going into those 1-drops, we have 9 1-drop creatures. We have a Crowing Crusader, which makes 1/1s when you target it with a spell. Cheeky House Mouse, which is a Savannah Lions and has a spell attached to it as an adventurer. Dragon's Rage Channeler, which is going to be quite easy to get Delirium just by casting lots of spells, and it gives us flying, which is something we don't have in too large of a quantity. Favored Hoplite, which is quite an impactful 1-drop. The difference between the power level of the 1-drops and 2-drop creatures is quite noticeable, but realistically I think all of them have some value, so hopefully it's fine. Favored Hoplite gets bigger as you grow it, and it prevents all damage that will be dealt to it, making it much easier to rumble in combat against similarly sized creatures. We then have Flowerfoot Swordmaster. This is one of the cards out of Bloomburrow. For 1 mana, you get a 1/2 that pumps all your mice when you target it, but for 3 mana, you get 2 creatures, and those pump each other as well. We then have Heartfire Hero, which gets bigger every time we target it, and it also can burn our opponent, which is going to be something we're going to need to close out games. Laguna Band Trailblazer. The main reason this is in here, obviously, aside from growing with Heroic, is that it has 4 toughness, and it makes it quite hard to remove, so it's going to be one of those threats that's a little bit easier to protect. We then have Rose Snacked, Heir of Rogar. I didn't know this card existed, but it's a 1-mana 0/1 with Battlecry, and when you cast it, you get an 0/1, when you target it. I think this is quite a good rate. It's going to be pretty meaningful that your opponent is encouraged to kill a 1-mana creature that has no power, and it lets the rest of the creatures get through, but it's an army in a can, and we really do want more copies of that. We then have Satyr Hoplite, very generic 1-mana 1/1 that gets bigger, and it's really just there for curve considerations. All of the other 1-drops are better in my opinion, but you do need a critical mass to make sure that you're not left with too many pump spells in your hand. Coming at 2 mana, we have Dreadhorde Arcanist. This is one of our points. This card is insane when you can protect it. So obviously there are lots of Grixis decks that play Dreadhorde Arcanist with counter magic. We're going with things like God's Willing to protect it instead, and you can use it to cast pump spells every turn. Notably, Dreadhorde Arcanist very rarely has more than 1 power when you're playing a blue X midrange deck, but in this deck it's going to be quite easy for us to cast 2-drop spells, or even greater than that. We then have Emberheart Challenger. This is another Bloomburrow card, and it lets us rip through our deck when we cast our cantrips. Basically, this is probably the best 2-drop in the deck, just because it actually gives you card quantity, but I do expect it to be relatively contentious with some of the other 2-drop slots, and making meaningful decisions during the game over which creatures to target is going to be a skill that you'll pick up as you play the deck. Next we have Illuminator Virtuoso. When it becomes the target of a spell, it connives, which is draw a card, discard a card. If you discard a non-land, it gets a counter. This has double strike, and this is the easiest way to blow people up. from higher life totals. However, the creature itself is very fragile. It's a 2-mana 1/1, so you really can't afford to be playing it too early. You'd rather be able to protect it, maybe outsize a burn spell, and then also protect it from a Swords to Plowshares variant, for example. We then have Phalanx Leader. Whenever you cast a spell, get a counter on all of your creatures. This is the worst of the 2-drops in my opinion, but I do think it's a nice role filler, and we do have several creatures in the 1-drop slot that do make creatures, so it's quite easy to get a little bit of value out of this, but I would expect you to connive this away or scry it away when given the opportunity. Next we have Rimrock Knight. This has an adventure which can pump one of your creatures, which is notable because it's also attached to a creature. One thing that comes up when playing heroic style decks is that if you have too many cards that target creatures and you run out of creatures because your opponent kills them all, it gets pretty hard to continue establishing your game plan. Rimrock Knight does both. A 2-mana 3/1 stat line is nothing to scoff at. It's a little bit weak on the toughness side, but at the very least it hits pretty hard. Lastly, we have 10th District Legionnaire. This card is great. It scries, it digs through our deck, it gets bigger when you cast it, and it has haste. Everything that we need. I would say it's about middle of the pack for our 2-drops, but it's still a good enough card to play. For sorceries, we have Ancestral Anger, which draws a card and gives trample, Homestead Courage, which gives vigilance and a counter and flashback, Reckless Charge, which gives haste and has flashback, Renegade Tactics, which you can use on your own creatures to cycle, but you can also use to push through damage on your opponent's creatures, and Rile, which also cantrips. One thing you're going to see as we go through the spells, because obviously the spells are a very important part of a heroic deck like this, is that most of the time we would prefer to take a smaller effect that draws a card than having a much bigger effect that is more susceptible to removal. Now, in saying that, we are playing all of the Giant Growth variants available in red and white, but there's a reason there are a lot of small, low-impact cards that cycle, just so we can rip through our deck and get our heroic triggers while maintaining a relatively stable hand size. For instance, we've got quite a lot, as expected. We have Brute Force, which is literally just Giant Growth, Crimson Wisp, which gives a creature haste and draws a card. You'll note that this card is $6, and if you don't want to buy it, that's perfectly fine, but I think it and Expedite, which give haste and cantrip, are actually really important to have in a deck like this, where so many of our threats can threaten to blow up our opponent, but we're susceptible to just putting them in play, hoping to protect them, and then trying to untap with them. Being able to hit several land drops by cantripping and then giving haste to a Virtuoso and blowing up your opponent out of nowhere is something that you really do want to have access to. Defiant Strike is next. This is a very boring card, +1/+0 and draw a card. God's Willing is one of our protection spells. We have quite a few in the deck. This one gives protection from a color and scries one, and it's one of the better ones, but it is important to know which protection spell you have in your hand and how you plan on playing around your opponent's removal. God's Willing gives protection from a color, which lets you attack through creatures if your opponent's creatures all have the same color, but it doesn't give it hexproof, and it doesn't give it indestructible, so there are still ways you can get around God's Willing for the turn. Infuriator's next. It's very similar to Brute Force. It just loses a point of toughness, but it's still too much damage to pass up. We then have Lightning Bolt. This is one of the few spells in the deck that doesn't target one of our own creatures, but we do just need to have access to actually premium cards. Lauren's Escape is the next protection spell, so it can give hexproof and indestructible, and then it scries. Notably for this one, it doesn't give protection from a color, so you can't use it to push damage like God's Willing can, but otherwise it's one of the more potent protection spells. We then have Might of the Meek. This gives trample, and the pump happens if you have a mouse, which you do have a couple of, but notably it gives trample and draws a card, and trample is something we do want when so many of our creatures can go tall but can't necessarily get through. Monstrous Rage is next. This card is incredible. It's playable in several formats at the moment. It's effectively a +3/+1, where one of that +1/+1 of that is a counter, and it gives trample. This card's great, nothing to say here. Mutagenic Growth, which you do not have to play if you don't want to, but if you're in an expected metagame that has a couple of ping effects, people are playing Renin 6 and Orcish Bowmasters, having a free spell that you can cast to protect one of your creatures that you might need to tap out for is relatively important, and the impact of Mutagenic Growth in your combo turns, saving your mana, is quite a big deal. Next up is Panic. This is a card that most people have probably never heard of. I know I hadn't heard of it until I built this deck. Target creature can't block this turn, cast only during combat before defense is chosen, draw a card at the beginning of the next upkeep. Realistically, it's just another Renegade tactic, so you can target your own creature and draw a card at the beginning of the next upkeep, but you can also use it to push through damage. Sheltering Light gives indestructible and scries 1, so it's just worse than Lauren's Escape, but what are you going to do? We do need as many protection spells as possible. Swords to Plowshares in the deck. You can play Path to Exile if you want, however, you can realistically get around the life gain that your opponent gains just by setting up a bigger combo turn. Titan's Strength gives +3 power and scry 1. It gives less toughness than Brute Force and Infuriate, but the scry 1 is worth it, so this is better than those if you're looking to add more creatures and trim some of these spells. Apostle's Blessing gives a creature protection from artifacts or from the color of your choice until end of turn for 1 mana and 2 life, realistically. Apostle's Blessing is a notable protection spell because you can cast it off a basic mountain, which you can't with any of the others. It also can give protection from artifacts, which means you can attack through an affinity opponent who doesn't have colored spells, so it's an important one to have and be able to scry to. Next up we have Legion Leadership. For 2 mana we get a instant that can double a creature's power and gives it first strike. Realistically, we're probably going to be playing it as a dual land more often than not. However, I wanted to make as many spell lands as possible without having to sacrifice on quality, and this card can just blow someone up. Sejiri Shelter is a tapped plains that can give a creature protection from the color of your choice. Nothing too much to say there. And then we have Team of Battle Rage. It's very important for a deck like this to have the ability to go over the top. It's very easy to outsize your opponent's creatures with some of your spells, but not be able to deal lethal damage. Excuse me. But Team of Battle Rage is worth the slot, in my opinion, and it's going to be very, very important to scry to and dig to during most of your matches. For artifacts, we have Skull Clamp. This is one of our points. Realistically, it's one of the better budget-friendly pointed cards. It's about $5-6, and it gives you a lot of value for it. It changes most of the games that it's played in, and in this deck in particular, we do have a number of ways to generate small creatures, and we can sack them to Clamp to make sure that we have more value going forward. For enchantments, these are all auras that can proc Heroic as well. So we have Cartouche of Solidarity, which gives Vigilance and which gives First Strike and makes a 1/1 with Vigilance. Cartouche of Zeal, which stops a blocker and gives Haste. Hyena Umbra, which gives the Umbra text and has First Strike, and Senator's Eyes, which gives Vigilance, but you can also cast from your graveyard to get extra triggers. All of these are fine. You can trim them down if you want to play more instants, but I think having access to Lurrus as a companion does encourage playing a couple of auras, just so that you can get more value. If you play Lurrus and Hyena Umbra it, there is going to be, a notable amount of difficulty for your opponent to get it off the board. For the mana base, we have Strip Mine as 2 of our points, but otherwise we've just got a couple of cheap dual lands and a Rockface Village for our mice. If you have access to a better mana base through Commander or Modern, I would highly encourage just a standard Fetch, Shock, Surveil land mana base, but in terms of a budget mana base, this has more dual lands than I thought it would, and having the extra basics is nice. For the sideboard, we have Lurrus, obviously, but then the rest of our spells are pretty standard. We We have Bifrost for our artifact opponents. We have Mother of Runes for grindier games. The reason Mother of Runes isn't in the main deck is that we don't really want to have to try to protect Mother of Runes and our other creatures. And if your opponent plays a removal spell, that's like a lightning bolt or a swords to plowshares, and you give your creature protection from that color with Mother of Runes, it could also turn off one of your pump spells that you're casting on that creature. So it's something notable there. We then have Path to Exile. You can put this in the main deck and the Swords to Plowshares in the sideboard if you want. I think it's much of a muchness, to be honest. We have two Rebs. We've got a Pyroblast and a Red Elemental Blast for our blue matchups. We have Reckless Rage for our creature matchups. Soul Guide Land for Graveyard Hate. Surge of Salvation for generic black-red removal. Oh, excuse me. Surge of Salvation for removal. Vexing Bauble for certain combo decks. Boros Charm, which will help you against Wrath effects, and it also does give Double Strike, which is a mode that most people don't know about, but that will come up with a deck like this. We have a sideboard for Theolingus. This is going to be for any matchup where you expect your opponent not to be playing creatures. However, it's not in the main deck because we're unlikely to have more creatures than our opponent. We're just likely to have bigger creatures. So for Theolingus is a bit of a risk in the main deck, but I do think there'll be slower matchups where you want to side it in. We then have an Invigorated Rampage, which can give trample to two separate creatures. So anytime you expect your opponent to be blocking with lots of tokens, like Grist Insect tokens, for example, Invigorated Rampage is probably a good thing to board in. We have a Kiln Fiend. This is specifically for combo matchups. If you need to race someone and you expect them not to be interacting with your creatures, Kiln Fiend kills people really, really quickly, so it's nice to have access to. And then we have a Razorgrass Ambush, which is a flip land, and it does 3 damage to an attacking or blocking creature. You can put this in the main deck if you want. It's just a bit of an expensive spell, and we don't want to be taking too much damage to be playing our lands. Notable exclusions from this deck, with the budget in mind: a Monastery Swiftspear, Soulscar Mage, Goblin Guide, a couple of creatures like that. I really wanted to put emphasis on the heroic and getting value out of our creatures. Monastery Swiftspear only gets bigger, and it only gets bigger for a turn, but we'd rather have a more stable board state where casting cantrips and cycling through them gives us more long-term benefits. If you want to make this deck at a higher budget, there are lots of ways you can do that. The mana base is going to be the main one, but I didn't really skimp too much in terms of the budget on the spell package. These are genuinely just the best spells you can be playing in these colors for a deck that looks like this. You can play a Ragavan if you want. You can remove the Lurrus and go a little bit bigger with White Plume Adventurer and Seasoned Dungeoneer, although I do think that this version of the deck is the most optimal if you're looking to be playing pump spells on your creatures. Otherwise, that's it for Boros Heroic. As always, the deck list will be in the description below, and please leave a comment if you do build the deck or lend it out to someone and let me know how it goes. This video was brought to you with the help and support of my lovely patrons and donors. If you'd like to support me and the content, you can click the links below, or if you just want to see your name up here on screen. If you like the content, please do consider subscribing. It helps out a ton and it's free, and you'll be notified of upcoming videos. But otherwise, leave a like if you like the video, and I'll catch you next time.